The day the cannon coughed up rain and the camp fell quiet, I began a letter I meant to keep, but prayed would outlive me. Jonah Crosby stood at the edge of the field, the cloth of his coat damp against his skin, the musk of smoke clinging to the air like a bad memory he couldn't shake. The river murmured softly behind the line of tents, the water's pale blue eyes blinking at the glow of a late sun that never seemed to set. Boots squelched in mud that remembered every step of every man who walked it, and the mule down near the wagon breathed in quick, sour breaths as if the animal shared the burden of every man's fear. Diakid's whistle, faint as a memory, drew his attention to the edge of the fields where a squad formed a stoic V, a living punctuation mark in a sentence the war kept rewriting. Jonah's breath smelled of iron and rain and coffee that had gone cold on a tin plate. "Solida," came a voice, rough with tobacco and sleep. "You look like you're writing prophecy instead of a letter." It was Mateo Calder, a thin man with eyes the color of wet slate, who carried a fiddle-string guitar in his pack and a stubborn belief that music could soften even a bayonet's edge. Jonah wiped his palm on the sleeve of his coat and turned. "If I'm writing anything, it's a memory for someone who's not yet born to read it," he said. Voice low, the words rough with disuse and relief at the thought of someone listening. Calder grinned, the scar at the corner of his mouth a map of days survived and days lost. "A baby's the best news a man can stitch to," he said. "What's the name?" "Hester," Jonah answered, though the newborn's name felt too small for the world he envisioned for her. He looked toward the canvas bag slung over his horse's saddle, where a cloth-wrapped bundle rested, so new it barely remembered the warmth of the mother who'd carried it. The girl's mother, Maeve, was back home, carrying the weight of another war waged in different fields, the kind a mother fights with quiet hands and unacknowledged prayers. Maeve's face rose like a memory from the shore of his thoughts. He pressed a finger to his lips, then touched the edge of the letter he'd begun to draft on a scavenged scrap of paper, a page that would become the backbone of another life. If he could tell her, if he could hold the newborn to his chest and tell her what the world had demanded of him, perhaps the world would listen a little more carefully to the sound of a child's breath. The first morning after Esther's birth came with a rain that smelled of iron and lilacs, the odd, stubborn sweetness that clung to a battlefield like a stubborn confession. Jonah's bunkmate, a big man named Jeremiah Hale, no relation to his own blood though the name felt like a shared rumor, woke with a grunt that turned into a sigh. "The baby?" Jeremiah asked, not needing to say more. The question hovered between the two men like a leash. Jonah nodded. Maeve sent a note with the messenger. "She's a strong little thing," he added, trying to sound as if he hadn't already mapped out the child's entire future in his mind, as if to pretend that a future could be designed in a moment between dawn and a drumbeat, strong enough to survive the first winter of a country at war, Jeremiah muttered, the words a rough-edged tenderness. That night, under a pallid, bruised sky, the camp's flicker of flames painted the canvas walls of their tents with shards of gold and orange, a theater of survival in which sound was the only true currency. The rain hissed against the canvas like a crowd murmuring at a distance, a sound that felt almost like the ocean's breath in a harbor. A dog bayed somewhere beyond, and a horse clopped, then quieted, the sound swallowed by the earth. The world smelled of wet hay, leather, and something sour behind the teeth, the copper tang of fear that every man learned to recognize as a friend and sometimes as a foe. In the hours that followed, Jonah wrote. He wrote words that would fill 40 pages, a letter meant for a daughter who had not yet learned to call his name. He paused only to listen to the night and the small items that reminded him of Maeve and the life they might still hold. He listened to the whisper of the river beyond the line, to the crackle of embers in a kettle, to the soft hiss of a rifle that spoke of danger in a language that sounded almost like a chorus. "Tell her I am doing the work that must be done," he murmured into the dark, as if the words could be carried by the breeze and land in Esther's cradle, a whisper that would cross the years. "Tell her our country is not saved by one life or one letter, but by the many we leave behind to tell the truth when we are gone." He set his jaw, the stubble on his chin catching a glint of the campfire. Hand dipped the pen again into the inky water. The 40-page letter began as a confession and grew into a map of his most ordinary days made sacred by the intention behind them. The pages would speak to a girl who would become a woman who would mourn him, and in the morning She would learn how a man could be free by paying a heavy price for someone else's freedom. He wrote of the first time he'd seen the white gleam of emancipation in the eyes of a field hand who had just learned to read. He wrote of the day Maeve woke with a fever, and the baby's small hands fluttered against the blanket like a cluster of white moths, and he could not go to them, not yet, and the memory of that ache would not leave him. "Do you write to your daughter in the first person?" Calder asked later, as they sat on empty crates waiting for orders. Jonah shrugged, a little shame in his eyes. "If I'm ever to be honest with her, I must be honest as a man is to himself," he said. "I want her to hear the rhythm of my voice through the storm of a cannon's echo." Calder looked toward the sky, where smoke hung like a stubborn veil. "Then write it as you would speak to a living breath," he suggested. "Speak to her as you would to Maeve or the river, or the old mule who knows when a ship is sinking off the coast of memory." And so the pages filled with his voice, part confession, part vow, part instruction, part letters to those who would never know the sound of his laugh. He wrote about the day the news arrived, general orders, a storm of marching orders, a decision to push toward the lines near Petersburg, to break a line that has held for longer than he could remember, the seasons changing. He described the field where the sun rose thin as a pale blade, and the weight of a gun in his hands as if it had become part of his own spine. He wrote about fear, how fear can sharpen a man's senses and dull his heart at the same time, how fear could be a loud, echoing drum, and how stillness could be the fiercest weapon of all. "A letter is a kind of bravery," Maeve often whispered in his memory, as if she floated above the camp with soft arms and eyes that remembered home. The sound of her whisper drifted through him when the air grew heavy with smoke and the ground trembled with distant thunder. On the third day after the letter's seed took root in his heart, a moment arrived that would decide what became of him and the pages he built in the quiet, when the world found him loud and active. A shell burst near the line, the sallow fog of gunpowder drifting like a pale breadcrumb trail toward his feet. The earth beneath him shook, and the air tasted of iron and rain, of bitter leaf and burnt pine. A flare of heat lit the sky, and through it he saw the faces of men who would be stripped of their lives in the space of a breath. He moved with the cadence of memory, counting seconds as a priest would count beads, saying a private litany of prayers that did not dare rise to the surface because the war demanded something raw and unrefined from a soul. "Hold there," a voice cried, a command to anchor their line as the Confederates pressed forward, with a ragged courage that looked almost admirable in its recklessness. The ground near him was a mosaic of splinters, broken copper, and the tremor of a chain-thin scream. The explosion sent a shiver through his bones, a sound like a tree breaking in winter. The world narrowed to a single thought: protect the line. Keep us from being seen as a failure in front of the children we have not yet met. "Crosby," out of the left came another voice, this from a man named Wilkes, whose humor had kept men from losing their minds more than once, in a long night of belly-aching hunger. "Take cover behind that ash wagon." The wagon groaned as the earth breathed through it, its wood darkened by smoke and rain, and a lifetime of wagons carrying something heavier than freight: hope, fear, and the stubborn desire to avoid being a statistic. Jonah moved as if he swam through the air, a slow swim that would take him into the heart of the storm rather than away from it. He felt the damp bite of the mud around his ankles, heard the whistle of a shell overhead, and tasted the cold iron of destiny on his lips. Then a line of words appeared in his mind, not as a memory but as a promise. "If I die, let it be with a clear eye and a steady breath so that she might know." In those seconds, he thought of Esther again, and the line he intended to place within the letter when the ink was dry: "If you never know me, know that I died for you to be free." The phrase turned over and over in his head, the words drawn with a careful hand across a page that would one day unfold in the hands of a child who would hardly believe the weight of her father's sacrifice unless told by that very paper. The struggle continued to tilt and tilt again as men shouted in tones that could have been prayers or curses. In those moments of shared panic, a creed emerged in the rough shelter of a battlefield: "We do not surrender the thing we hold most dear, even if the air between us grows too thin to breathe." When the immediate danger slackened enough to allow sleep to return to the eyes of the living, Jonah lay flat on his back and looked upward through the storm of smoke toward a moon that hid behind clouds, as if shy of the violence below. He could feel the damp of the ground seeping into his shirt, could taste the grit between his teeth, could hear the distant hiss of rain tapping the top of his hat's brim. The letter lay tucked beside his heart, wrapped carefully in a canvas wrapper, his own little chest against which his daughter's name would be pressed as if she would live inside it with him. The days bled into one another, each hour a bead on a rough string, and the pages grew longer, as if every moment the war did not end was a moment the letter could not end either. He wrote of the people he had loved, the memory of Maeve's laughter that used to ride a breeze into his bones, of Esther, the newborn whose small cry could cut through the din of battle as sharply as a saber's edge, of his old mother, who once told him that a man's worth isn't measured by the battles he wins, but by the mercy he grants in the face of fear. He wrote of a future that would not come to pass in this life, of a world where slavery's last chains finally snapped, where children would learn the alphabet, not from a ledger of property, but from the light in their teacher's eyes. "Do you think she will forgive us for what we've done?" Calder asked one night, the question breaking through the murmur of the camp like a stray wind snatching a flame. Jonah did not answer with certainty. "If forgiveness is possible," he said softly, "it's written in the gaps between our words, the things we do when the easy path lies somewhere else." He paused, listening to the hush after the camp had finally quieted, to the distant crash of a wave against a riverbank that sounded as if the world were sighing. "She will judge us by our courage, not our perfection. If I can give her a memory worth carrying, maybe she won't hate the world for its wounds." The letter, this imagined daughter's future guide, grew thick with his careful drafts, his careful thoughts. He inserted a promise into the 22nd page. "I will tell you about the hot days when the sweat ran like rain down my back, about the nights the frost made the air taste like fear and metal." He promised that he would tell her that he kept faith in something bigger than his fear, that he believed in the day when a child could breathe free air because the country chose to be free. He scrawled a page that spoke of the emigrants' dream and the abolitionists' courage and the stubborn farmers' patience, a mosaic of people who did not belong to him by blood, but did belong to his future. The fighting eased the first moment of the third day, but then a second storm gathered in the distance. A rumor of drums and the hiss of bullets, and the way a man's heart sounded when it was pressed into his ribs by a hand that was not his own. Jonah rose with the dawn that did not bring relief, but a handful of responsibilities. He moved to intercept a skirmish, dividing his attention between the living and the memory he promised to share with a child who would someday read his words and feel the weight of a father's vow in her small hand. The letter grew into something more than a personal letter to a daughter. It became a shelter for a man who would otherwise have been unmade by fear. He wrote of the way a life is saved, not by the sword alone, but by the willingness to lay down one's life to ensure that another can be free. The 40 pages were a testament, a ledger of what it means to pay the price, a map of a future where the child could walk into a world with less pain than the one he faced. Then came the moment that would set the course of the entire story. A line held against a wave of men who had learned to call themselves Hope. The Confederates pressed hard, their songs of iron clanging like church bells in a storm. Jonah's unit found themselves back to back with the men they had marched with for months, and the line zigzagged, as if the earth itself was trying to decide where to draw a boundary between survival and surrender. A shell cracked somewhere to his left, splinters flying like orange sparks, and Jonah felt something break inside him, an ache not of bone but of something more necessary torn from his chest. The kind of pain that makes a man look at his future as if seeing it through the lens of a broken window. He moved toward the noise, toward the men who would press forward with him, toward the child's letter he had written as a vow, spoken aloud only by the quiet courage of a man who refused to abandon his future. "Crosby." A voice shouted, "The line!" and he obeyed, stepping into the breach as others ducked beneath the wet of a musket. The world narrowed again to a single purpose. Hold on, survive the day. Ensure that the lines do not slip, and the world does not forget what they choose to defend. When the smoke finally settled enough to see again, the field lay quiet in that way a battlefield does after a storm, spent, wounded, and unforgettable. Jonah stood, breath fogging in the cold air, his hands shaking, not from fear now, but from the sudden realization that the end of this day would likely end a life that could bear the weight of a child's future only because of the price he paid. He looked down at the pocket where the canvas-wrapped letter lay, the pages within stubbornly soft with sweat and rain, and the long time since they were written. The thought of Esther, his newborn daughter, flooded him with a fierce tenderness he hadn't permitted himself to let rise above the mud and steel of war. A sharp cry cut through the quiet, and a hand found his shoulder. The hand belonged to an officer whose face wore the pale mask of a man who has seen too much. "You're needed," the man whispered, not loudly enough for the others to hear, but loud enough for Jonah to understand the gravity of this moment. The mission was to hold a line longer, to buy the ground that would become the memory of a generation. "Go," Jonah told the officer, with a calm that surprised him more than the other man. "Tell them we will hold." The officer nodded once, and Jonah looked toward the river, toward the place the sun had refused to give him this day. He found a moment of stillness, a brief, almost holy silence where the world paused to honor the living and the dead both. In that moment he whispered the words he had kept on his lips all day, a prayer that did not rise in ceremony but fell with the gravity of existence. "If I am to die, let me die with a memory that can be read by a child who has never seen me and never will. Let Esther know in the cold truth of a letter that I stood for her, that I died so she might walk in light." Then came the final breath of a man whose body would endure no more, whose spirit would carry the weight of his own promise into a place where war would no longer hold him in its iron grip. He fell, and the field drank in the silence like a thirsty beast. The day moved on without him, and the river kept its quiet watch over the bodies and the broken plans of war. 3 days after the battle, the camp near Petersburg was already turning toward the next march, the next night of cold rain and bread that tasted like old pennies. But for Jonah Crosby, the end of his life coincided with the end of the second page of the letter and the careful conservation of a future memory for Esther. 3 days after his final breath, his comrades found him where he had fallen, his hand still clutching the canvas wrapper around the letter, as if in that moment he had refused to let go of what he believed he could secure with the last measure of his strength. The officers ordered a quick, quiet burial in the field, a shallow trench, a simple wooden altar made of 2 boards placed as a cross, the dirt thrown with a quiet respect that soldiers often reserve for the dead who stood in the way of a future they hoped to protect. The letter, soaked through with rain and a soldier's sweat, remained where it had fallen, tucked beneath his uniform, a testament to the life that would be studied by future generations, as much for its language as for its courage. Back at Maeve's home, the newborn Esther slept with a hum of new life in the room, the scent of new clothes and clean linen mixing with the soft old smell of the hearth. Her mother, Maeve, wrapped in the quiet ache of childbirth and the fierce endurance of love, would rock slowly in the chair by the window, listening to the river outside and the memory of a man she had loved who had walked out of her world with a promise that the world would remember him in a way that would help the child know she was free. She whispered to the infant, as if Esther could hear the old man's voice in her own breathing, "Your father believed you would be free, little one." And he paid it forward with every breath he took, even when his body could not bear one more breath for himself. The 40 pages did not vanish into the mud of that field. They survived the rain and the heat and the fear and the moment of death in a way that seemed almost miraculous. A courier who survived the chaos carried the letter eventually to a nurse who had tended the wounded at the hospital. The nurse, a woman named Lila Marsh, kept the letter wrapped in a bag of waxed linen because she believed it was not merely the words of a man. It was a memory of a country trying to free itself from a chain it refused to yield to. Lila's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, and she read the lines with a reverence that did not belong to a battlefield, but to the possibility of a future. In her quiet hours, she read aloud to others in the ward, and the words of a man who would never see Esther's face carried a stubborn hope into the crowded rooms of the hospital. They whispered about the "if you never know me" line, the way the sentence folded into a vow, and the way a nation might be saved not by a blow, struck in a moment of triumph, but by the quiet realism of a father's insistence that his child would be free. The nurse, who had learned to listen to the dying and to hold the living steady with a soft voice, understood that this letter would outlive the war's noise. She promised to deliver it to Esther when the day came, and she would ask the girl to read it aloud to her mother, and to any other child who would grow up unreachable by the past. The letter became a thread that connected a soldier's last breath to a child's future breath. Years passed, and Esther grew into a bright, stubborn girl who asked questions that had no easy answer. She studied maps and old newspapers, and the stories of soldiers who never spoke of their own fear. She learned to read by lamplight at night, and to listen to the river's memory when the day grew too loud. The world around her shifted. Older men and women spoke less of battles, and more of the way memory moves through families like a wind through a forest. And in a moment that seems almost ordinary in retrospect, she found the envelope that had been kept by a nurse who believed some things must be saved. A letter that had never seen the daylight of recognition until the right moment. It was a quiet morning when the envelope, brittle with age, found its way into Esther's hands. She turned the brittle parchment with a care born of fear and awe, as if the words might crumble the moment she touched them. The nurse who had kept the letter now watched with a calm tenderness, the kind of gaze that holds a lifetime of stories behind a single, unassuming glance. Esther's fingers trembled, then steadied as she opened the waxed linen wrapper and uncovered the 40 pages, for the writing still legible enough to walk again into a daughter's life. The pages were not merely ink on paper. They were a life laid bare in careful ink, the voice of a man who wanted to give his daughter a compass. Esther began to read, her eyes tracing the lines of the letter, and there, beneath a sentence that warned her not to fear the unknown, she found the line his voice had chosen to anchor his love to the world. "If you never know me, know that I died for you to be free." The words landed in Esther's chest like a bell tolling for someone who had finally arrived at the truth of her own birthright. She stood in the quiet hospital room, the soft scent of lavender coming from a tub of water by the window, and the distant clang of a city that never slept. And she felt a connection to a father she would never fully know in life, but could now understand through the paper he had left behind. The letter's content extended beyond the moment of death, beyond the battlefield's smoke and the river's slow current. It spoke of compassion, justice, and an insistence on a future where every child could claim a life unburdened by the chains of another's desire to own a person. It spoke of a mother's quiet bravery and the tireless labor of a wife who carried the memory of home, who kept faith while the world's noise grew louder and more dangerous. It spoke of a country that had to endure violence to learn to breathe again, a nation that would only find its way toward liberty when the people refused to stay silent about the truth of what it meant to be free. Esther read every page aloud to her mother, and as the words filled the room, the weathered ink, the careful margins, the careful letters that had yet to be read in their own time, the mother's eyes filled with both grief and clarity. They spoke to each other in a language that needed no armor, the language of memory, of lineage, of the stubborn hope that a child can inherit not simply a name, but a history that will shape her decisions, her courage, and her own sense of what it means to be free. "Your father believed in you before you could ever understand belief," Maeve whispered to Esther, the room's air turning soft and warm around their shared breath. "He paid a debt for you that you can never owe back. But you can pay forward by living with a conscience as honest as the ink he used to write." Esther, who had grown up in a world of whispers about a man who died for her, looked out the window at the river that had carried so many stories to their town and back again. She could not know all the battles her father had fought, not in her youth, not yet. But she knew the power of a single breath taken with courage, the way a single letter could bend a country toward a future it had yet to deserve. She knew she would tell the story of the C-308 soldier who wrote 40 pages for a newborn daughter, and died 3 days later, that she would tell it not as a history lesson, but as a testament to the power of ordinary people who chose to do something extraordinary because they believed in freedom. The world did not stop turning when Jonah Crosby died. It turned, and then it learned to remember. The pages of his letter, carefully preserved, became a cherished artifact in the family, a touchstone for Esther when she faced the long questions life throws at us. What is a life worth? What does it mean to be truly free? How do we honor those who gave their lives so we could have the chance to live ours in dignity? The letter's voice did not age. It grew more alive, more necessary in the telling of it, in the sharing of it with a new generation that would inherit a country still healing from its own wounds. "If you never know me, know that I died for you to be free." The sentence lived on, a stubborn flame in the heart of a country that was still learning how to claim its own liberty without lending itself to the old vices that had created a history of pain. The line was not merely a promise made by a wounded man. It became a rule of life for Esther, a reminder that the freedom she inherited was not free in itself, but was purchased with the courage of those who stood and faced the night so that another child could rise into the morning. And so the story of Theresen Waite, the soldier who wrote a 40-page letter to his newborn daughter and died 3 days later, stayed alive through the generations that followed. It lived in the rustle of pages, in the whisper of a mother's lullaby, in the careful handwriting of a father's careful promise, and in the quiet, steadfast breath of a child who grew up to be brave, not because she assumed the right to be, but because she understood the cost it required to become free. The letter did not end with one man's last words. It multiplied their effect, becoming a beacon for those who would one day choose the harder road, the road toward an honest liberty that accepts responsibility as a daily companion. Esther learned this and carried it within her like a light she could share with others in work, in faith, in the simple, unglamorous acts of every ordinary day. So the narrative of the soldier who called himself C308, who took a quill to the night and wrote a life within a life, ends not with the silence of a single death, but with the ongoing voice of a daughter who would never forget. The 40 pages were not a goodbye alone. They were the first chapter of a continuous conversation about what it means to be free, how to love well, and how to honor the memory of a man who believed that even in the darkest days, a single act of courage could light a future for someone who would come after him. If Esther ever read these pages aloud in a quiet room, with the river's memory listening through the window, she would hear his voice once more.